Do you ever feel like you belong to two worlds but fully to neither? Like you remember something that no longer exists, yet you're fluent in something that feels too new to be home? If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you probably know that feeling without being able to name it. You are not quite Gen X and not quite Millennial. You were shaped by one era and launched into another. And living at that hinge does something subtle but permanent to the psyche. You remember a childhood that moved slower, not nostalgic fantasy slow, structurally slow. If you left the house, you were gone. No tracking, no texting, no ambient awareness. Silence wasn't suspicious, it was normal. You learned independence without documentation. You fell off bikes without evidence. You embarrassed yourself without permanent record. Your mistakes dissolved instead of living online forever. That kind of childhood builds a certain internal architecture. It builds tolerance for boredom. It builds imagination. It builds the ability to sit in your own mind without reaching for distraction. But just as your identity was solidifying, the world accelerated. The internet didn't raise you. It arrived while you were becoming yourself. You remember the first email address, the first chat room, the first time you realized you could talk to someone across the world through a screen. You learned technology not as background noise, but as transformation. That matters psychologically. You understand that the digital world is constructed. You remember the before, and that memory creates a permanent sense of contrast. Unlike younger generations who grew up fully immersed in algorithmic culture, you experienced the transition. You know what it felt like when attention wasn't constantly fragmented. You remember when work ended because the office closed. You remember when social comparison was limited to physical spaces. And yet, you also adapted. You mastered email. You navigated social media. You built careers in digital environments. You became technologically bilingual, but bilingual doesn't mean native. It means you translate constantly. This constant translation is part of why you don't fully fit. You understand Gen X skepticism because you witnessed analog adulthood forming around you. But you also understand millennial optimism and digital fluency because you entered adulthood alongside it. You move between generational conversations with ease. You can explain one side to the other. But when someone tries to describe your generation, it feels blurry. You are often folded into larger categories that don't quite capture your timing. And timing, psychologically, is everything. Your adolescence happened in relative stability. The late 80s and 90s carried a sense of linear progress. Study hard, get a degree, build a stable life. The script seemed predictable, but then adulthood arrived, and the script fractured. The dot-com bubble burst just as many of you were stepping into the workforce. September 11th hit not as distant news, but as a rupture in early independence. The 2008 financial crisis landed when many of you were trying to consolidate careers, buy homes, or start families. Stability became provisional. The future no longer felt guaranteed. This layering of acceleration and instability shaped a distinct psychological tone. You are optimistic, but cautious. You believe in effort, but you don't assume systems are stable. You prepare for change because you've seen it arrive suddenly. You don't panic during disruption. You recalibrate. You grew up watching structures shift in real time. That creates resilience, but it also creates a subtle ongoing alertness. There's also the question of attention. You remember when media consumption had limits, when you had to wait for a show to air, when you couldn't binge everything instantly, when boredom forced creativity instead of scrolling. Your brain developed under different rhythms, and now you live in a world of constant stimulation. You adapted, but your nervous system still carries memory of slower pacing. That's why endless notifications can feel draining rather than neutral. You know life without them, so you feel the contrast. In relationships, this transitional identity plays out too. You value in-person conversation because that's how you learned connection. But you're also comfortable with digital communication. You can text, email, video call. You inhabit both spaces, yet sometimes you miss the weight of unmediated presence, the simplicity of it, the edges between being connected and being alone. You remember when logging off meant something. Now, the boundary is blurred. At work, you often become the bridge. Older colleagues appreciate your understanding of structure and loyalty. Younger colleagues relate to your adaptability and technological competence. You can explain hierarchy to one group and flexibility to another. You are fluent in both languages, but being the bridge can feel invisible. Bridges are essential, but they aren't destinations. You connect, but you don't always feel centrally identified. This in-between positioning can create quiet identity fatigue, not crisis, not confusion, just subtle misalignment. When generational debates erupt, you understand both sides, but neither feels fully yours. You weren't entirely shaped by analog adulthood, nor entirely by digital adolescence. You were shaped by the transition itself, and transitions are unstable by nature. There's also something rare about your cohort. You are among the last to have a childhood that was largely undocumented and an adulthood that is hyper-documented. You experienced privacy as default. You also experienced exposure as norm. That duality creates a distinct relationship with visibility. You understand that online presence is constructed. You remember when identity was less performative. That memory can make constant curation feel artificial, not necessarily wrong, just layered. If you've ever felt slightly out of step, slightly ahead and slightly behind at the same time, that's not confusion, it's timing. You were born at a hinge point in cultural history. You didn't grow up fully inside one paradigm. You grew through a shift, and shifts shape people differently than stability does. They create flexibility, pattern recognition, and comfort with ambiguity, but they also create longing for clear belonging. The Xennial psychology is not about nostalgia or superiority. It's about inhabiting discontinuity without collapsing. It's about holding two timelines in oneself. You carry memory of a quieter world and competence in a louder one. You remember when attention wasn't currency, and you live in a time when it is. You remember when being unreachable was normal, and you exist in a culture of perpetual contact. You don't fully fit because you were never meant to be contained by a single narrative. You are the connective tissue between eras. You understand that reality can change quickly because you watched it happen. You adapt because you had to. You question because you've seen systems falter. You value depth because you remember slowness. And perhaps the reason you sometimes feel undefined is because you are what change looks like when it becomes human. Belonging doesn't always come from fitting neatly into a category. Sometimes it comes from recognizing that you are the hinge, not entirely one side or the other, but essential to both. And in a world that continues to accelerate, the people who remember transition may be the ones best equipped to navigate what comes next.